Caddis Maximus here, this time with a review and comparison of both side cutters and end snips, or end cutters, or rivet cutters. I always forget what these flush cutters are supposed to be called. I've been doing a lot of different plier style tool reviews. I'm talking about many pliers that aren't meant for cutting steel wire, piano wire, etc. The last review I did discuss some heavy duty electrical wire cutters, as well as some steel cable cutters and steel strap cutters, etc. And so from the few tools that weren't related to electrical wire cutters in the last review, these are the more heavy duty cutters. There's only one exception, which is a couple of Maasaki cutters here, and I actually tried finding more information about them, but apparently Maasaki, M-A-S-A-K-I, is a fairly common either name or term that's used in Japanese. So when I searched for it, there were just a million different things called Misaki, and I couldn't find who really made these types of cutters. Let's go ahead and talk about these. These are some interesting cutters. They are indeed, you can see Misaki made in Japan, but I just couldn't figure out what these were intended for at all. I don't know if they're for textiles or something along those lines, but I remember finding these, and particularly this set, which has this very interesting, very sharp hemispherical cutting jaw on it. This I've actually used on the plastic pegs that hold together many components on automobiles. Out of all the things to get at those little pegs and trying to poke them out, a lot of them you have to push the pin in and they'll come out, but they don't ever really want to extract, and it's always kind of difficult to really get a decent grip on them. These types of cutters, and I use them more like pliers, are just excellent for that. That hemispherical shape, they open extremely wide. I'm able just to get under either the head of a pin and grab it out, or the whole plastic connector and get a nice grip on it. And because it's just so, the hemispherical shape, this really allows you to get in some pretty tight spaces and just yank them out. And in the worst case scenario, since they're plastic, and you can use these just to cut them off and then get the panel or whatever you need out and then fish out the little plastic holder. Napa has big racks of those plastic holders of all the different sizes, so I never really worry about ruining or cutting off any, because they're just so commonly replaced. They're just really easy to find, and obviously you can go to a junkyard and get as many as you could ever desire. The other style of Misaki is these 45-degree angle nips, and these I've really found to be handy as well, just when I really need to get a nice flush cut. But a side cutter is too straight. And of course, an end nip is also the wrong position. It's nice to have a set that's actually at 45 degrees. And I just remember not to use these for steel wire so I don't damage the edge. They really are sharp and work well. If we're going to talk about brands, we do have some Harbor Freights here. We have ChannelLocks, of course, some GreenLees, some old Crescents. We have our Oxos, some more Crescents. We have these Craftsman heavy-duty cutters, and even an Enders set. Let's go and start talking about side cutters here. I do like these Oxos. I've mentioned these in other reviews and comparisons of the other tools. They're not as well built as many other hand tools, but they're not bad. And what I always appreciated about them was their really large, oversized, and very heavily cushioned grips with a pretty soft cushioning. So that gives you it's both a plus and a minus. It's a plus because they're so soft. It's a minus because they're soft enough to get damaged. If these get really beaten around the bottom of a toolbox, these grips will end up getting cut apart. But when they're intact, they're just amazing, and they're just so soft. It's really, really just nice and comfortable to use. We have some of the Harbor Freight Quinns, and some of my other reviews I forgot to include. I have reviewed this three-piece set of electrically insulated pliers from Harbor Freight Quinn, but I forgot to include the individual pieces in these reviews and comparisons. Excuse me there. So these are the Harbor Freight Quinn side cutters, and they actually work just fine. These newer brand of pliers are actually much better than any of the others I've ever experienced, and they cut just like anything you would expect. They actually have a pretty decent finish. They're just maybe not as thick a beam, just not quite as heavy duty as, say, a pair of ChannelLocks, but they're a welcomed improvement to the average quality of Harbor Freight tools. And I mentioned in other reviews, Harbor Freight's now become a huge corporation. They actually just sent out their latest ads. You'll notice they're getting bigger is like the 25% off ads, which used to be standard, are now one day only. and now their standard coupons are just 20% off. But they don't even advertising how many stores they have. Now they surpassed 800. But when any company advertises $100 million inventory reduction, you know that's a huge corporation. And that reduction is just them cleaning out all the old stuff to replace with all this newer, admittedly more expensive, but higher quality tools. So Harbor Freight's trying to step up the game again. Now they've become a pretty big player in the tool market. If we look at some others, this is what side cutters, a much older pair. These are some old Crescents, and they are great. And the thing about side cutters is they really haven't changed much at all over the decades. It's just such a straightforward and basic tool. I picked these up because these are a vintage pair, and as we can see, the jaws are in excellent condition, which is basically unheard of on an old pair of side cutters. Inevitably, people cut some type of very hard wire, and it just leaves a notch in them. And so that's one thing you'll want to remember is you usually want to have two pairs of side cutters, because inevitably you're going to be cutting some kind of hard steel wire, and it's going to ding up and dent the jaws. That's just the nature of what happens. Unless you're just cutting real soft steel tie wire, hard steel wire, these will cut, but they'll only cut so much because they're also made out of steel. And when you're cutting a material that's nearly as hard as the cutters themselves, they will get damaged. And so that's the point I wanted to make, is that you always want to have basically two pairs of side cutters, one for more abusive situations where you may be cutting off nails and screws and that kind of stuff, and then a second pair that you keep the jaws nice for cutting wire and other soft materials. And then these are your standard ChannelLock 337s here. We do have a pair of GreenLees. These are just a little bit nicer just because they have a pretty thick, soft grip, and long handles. So these are actually really comfortable to use, and they have little kicks on each end of the grip so your hand doesn't want to slide down. And being a little bit longer, they're just a bit easier to use, and I've always appreciated that. The criticism is that the overmolding is overmolded on the hard green plastic, and so right in the center of the grip, where the GreenLee has the word GreenLee, that will never wear out because it's a plastic, but unfortunately it kind of creates a pressure riser, so the nice soft comfortable grip is a little bit's taken away because you have that hard plastic right in the middle. But otherwise, GreenLee is a really high quality brand, and these work pretty well. One thing I was going to mention is none of these are perfect, even these GreenLees. As we can see, the handles here, if we have that lined up, the handles aren't quite straight on these, but that's just one thing that does happen. Not all tools are made perfectly. I did buy those used, so I'm definitely not too disappointed. Other types of utility cutters would be like these. These are the Harbor Freight mini, I think they call them the mini bolt cutters. I don't use them as cutting bolts. I just use them as much heavier duty versions of wire cutters. Now, when you're cutting, say, stronger steel wire, this is a part of a one of those plant nest things, or it could also be used for heavy duty fencing. You really need a pretty strong pair of pliers, and so that's what these are for. And even though these will cut this, you still need quite a bit of force. It's surprising. So of course they work well, and they are compound. Just when you're cutting thicker wire like this, which is this 1/8 inch galvanized mild steel wire, it's surprising how much additional force that you need. So even using a little pair of mini bolt cutters, you have to put in quite a bit of force. Now here's a tool that Harbor Freight hasn't sold for, I think, about 10 years or so. And it's real kind of a shame, because they had heavy duty compact cutters, and that was these. These are also compound cutters, but you can see that the angles and the way the geometry is just a bit different. And these I always found to be quite handy because they have this hook, and what they're designed to do is to open up for you to have a piece of wire. Say you're cutting several pieces of wire. They're designed to make it easy because the hook just catches the wire, so it's easy to get into the jaws. And then because they have an even greater force ratio, compound force ratio, cutting can be done with one hand versus two hands with the mini bolt cutters. Even though both sets of these pliers are about the same length, you do have more force associated with these. And I've actually used these quite a bit for cutting heavier steel cable, and you can see the jaws have actually held up well. So for a real cheap tool, it's surprising how useful these have been for me, because you can just catch onto the piece of wire and just goes right into the jaw, super fast and easy, and you can cut it. And because they make it much easier to cut very thick cross-section materials. So the other thing that we have is, of course, end cutters. These are sometimes called rivet cutters, and that's all they are, side cutters, but they cut at 90 degrees to the handle instead of almost flush with the handle, and so you can get up close to things and nip them off. This is a pair of Crescents here, and they're actually pretty decent. I was going to mention that this is a situation where the channel locks are actually really nice. These channel locks here, these are the 357s, are really heavy duty. As far as these type of end cutters, the channel locks in this kind of standard 7-8 inch size are some of the heaviest duty and most or strongest ones I've seen. They just have a really huge thick head hot rivet in there, heavy thick forged beams, and then just a lot of meat up in the head, even compared to a Crescent, which is a pretty good brand and does have a nice finish. These channel locks really are some of the very best. One thing I do appreciate about the external rivet versus the flush hot rivet is external rivets or external non-flush hot rivets do tend to hold up a little better under heavier duty situations and hold tighter over the long term. Secondly, if they do loosen up, since the heads are exposed, you can just put it between a piece of steel and take a hammer and hammer it some to get it to tighten back up. One thing to note, and I'll show you on another set here, is whenever you buy these, even from channel locks, which are really great, these type of pliers, it's actually pretty critical that the cutting surfaces really made up right on top of each other. And this is pretty darn good. But it really makes a difference to how these perform, how well those surfaces made up. And you'll occasionally run into a pair where they're just not mated up very well, and then they really have a hard time cutting. But these are always supposed to cut real nice and clean, like so. Even though the edge is a little more blunt, it's designed for strength, so you can cut steel wire and nails and screws and that type of thing. Also, a set like these real heavy-duty channel locks are great as nail pullers. You can just get a little bit of the nail, and as soon as you get it up on the edge, you can really kind of get it to pull out. Same with staples, and then roll it up. It doesn't pull particularly far, but you can, since they have a jaw that extends beyond the edge, you can grab a nail, roll it up, and then reach down and then do that again to pull it out. And I've actually used these quite often for that purpose, just because you get a lot of leverage and it's easier on your hand. And once you start to pull a nail up to get a hammer or another tool on it, you already have this tool in your hand, so it's just another couple quick motions to finish pulling the nail rather than just getting it out some and then switching the hammer. Just takes more time and effort. But I really did want to recommend these 357s. If you're going to get end cutters, these channel locks for a regular size are probably going to be your best bet. They really are just some of the thickest and heaviest ones I've seen. Continuing on, there have been other designs, such as this old Craftsman Handy Cut. Here we are. And these are made out of a couple pieces of plate steel. They just have a couple really huge bolts. And the cutting surface is pretty close to the line of the pivot. And these have always worked interesting. The way they're designed, you can also see as they cut, they kind of pull in. So they do both a cutting and a slicing action at the same time. Another innovative feature isn't just that the blades replaceable, but if you're always cutting towards the back of the jaw and the back part of the jaw gets really dinged up, you can flip this blade around to the other side and it'll move the good edge that's up here, for instance, to the back, so then you'll essentially get twice as much work out of it. And then they do include a forged steel bottom part. And these really do work pretty well. Whenever you're cutting any kind of steel cable or heavy-duty wire, it's just really nice to use these. They're actually pretty comfortable, and it's kind of a shame that Craftsman doesn't have these anymore. The primary reason, them being a heavy-duty cutter that has a replaceable blade, that was just really handy. Although the blade in this is something that you could either hand file or make at home, surprisingly enough, because all it is a blade with just an offset tang to attach it to the top jaw. But all the force is really just going from the jaw to the top of the blade. Although I've seen replacements on eBay. But I did want to point out, these are sometimes unique looking. I've seen them from other brands as well. These are just the Craftsman's, or ones that look similar, and I've always had really, really good luck with this style of cutter. So I did want to point that out. Now these end snips, oftentimes they make these in very large, and those really are for getting under the edges of aluminum rivets and just snipping them off. So one brand that we have here, these things aren't always made so great. We do have a pair of Enders here, some 7B10s. Enders is an American-made tool company, but they were the cheap American-made tools. There's no question about it. Enders tools were never very good. They're always kind of the budget brand and okay for their price. The only real reason to get them is because they are abbreviated ET, the extraterrestrial tools. One of the things you really notice is that they don't have a flush mount hot rivet, but it was just so poorly made, so uneven, that you can see how thin it is over the top here. This is so thin that really, under real tough situations, if you are prying the handles apart, you could probably get this rivet to break, and that's just one aspect of why Enders are cheaper. The second thing is, if we look, and I did not pay $10 for these, that's for sure, once I pointed out the defects. The other one is this. If you look, it is not square with the handle, so really just not so great. The other thing is they did get the jaws to match up evenly, but they did make a sacrifice here. If we look closely, we can see that one part of the jaw is sharp and one part's actually pretty flat. And they did that on the other side. So once they assembled these, what they did is they just ground some of the sharp edges of the jaw to make it look like they close properly. But instead you have one side that's really sharp and one side that's actually pretty blunt. So these are actually my kind of torture units. The other thing is they're like partially forged, but the hooks, you can see they actually bent over to make the hook, and that makes the metal much weaker there. So just to give an example of some lower quality ones, these are right next to some ChannelLocks, and I'll have to dig up the model number. These have always been odd because these are ChannelLocks, but they didn't stamp the model number on these. But these are the big ChannelLock end cutters, and these, like the smaller ones, are really just, you know, some of the best, some of the very heaviest duty. You'll be hard pressed to find a set of cutters that are like 12-inch flush cutters that are going to be any higher quality or heavier duty than these ChannelLocks. They have just an extremely large rivet in the middle. It's just huge. You can see that head compared to the size of my thumb. It's almost 5/8 in diameter, and it is indeed an external rivet, so it's very good. These are very tight. Really thick, oversized forged jaws. You can just see how much material that they have in there. And when they cut flush, they are truly flush. And out of all these are just about perfect. If we look, we can see that those cutting edges on both sides, the tips, the absolute tips there, line up perfectly on both sides. And so it's, even with these, it's kind of rare to find. So when I found these, I was actually pretty happy about that because they had great condition tips, and these were made just perfectly. You can see that they come together just spot on. There's no light that gets through there. And so the deal with these is when you open them, they actually protrude out a little bit. You can get under the edge of a rivet, and it starts to pry up the rivet and then cut it right off. And that's really what the purpose of these large ones is so that you can pry up and then cut off aluminum rivets, which are used everywhere, not just aircraft, but truck trailers and just all sorts of stuff. And of course, when you have ones that have really nice quality or nice condition jaws, they also cut just beautifully. These have so much leverage and such oversized rigid handles that these are almost a one-finger cutter. You basically have to put in almost no force just to get a nice, beautiful cut. So these things have actually been pretty handy when I need to cut into plastics, cut little slots, all sorts of useful things. So it's actually quite nice to have a large pair of flush cutters, just because it makes your job a lot easier. Your efforts aren't spent just trying to get the handles to come together. They're more spent making sure that you have control and it's square on whatever you're cutting. And then when you do want to cut, it's just a very little effort. So I do recommend having a large set, and preferably from a good company. So anyway, I think that's about the end of a review and comparison of both side cutters and flush cutters, otherwise known as heavy-duty general use cutting tools. And this was just to compare some various different designs and styles and aspects of them, and really ones I'd recommend, such as the ChannelLocks, and especially when it comes to flush cutters. They really set themselves apart. They really want their flush cutters to really be well respected. It's kind of strange, but definitely glad for it. And now you can compare various forms of cutters depending on the type of wire and cable that you're cutting, and some various different brands, and really what to look for, particularly when it comes to flush cutters and making sure that they line up properly. It'll make your life a lot easier. Anyway, I really appreciate everybody watching, and please subscribe. Catus Maximus out.